Over a century has passed since 10 men were hanged in Carbon County, Pennsylvania in 1877. Their deaths signaled the destruction of the Molly Maguires, an organization that has been more revered than feared in recent years. The group's legacy, which echoes throughout the region, has slowly seeped into the national consciousness and continually reasserts its relevance. The mountainous anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania is forever marked by reminders of its past. While the coal industry is now largely abandoned in the region, it once offered prospects of fortune and economic prosperity. Unfortunately, it was the region's most dispossessed citizens who labored the most for the least reward. Men and boys, many recent Irish immigrants, toiled ceaselessly in brutal conditions far below the earth and lived in squalid poverty. As unions faltered and hopes for change dimmed, a resentment built that birthed the Molly Maguires, an organization with a capacity for violence that rivaled the mine owners. The Lackawanna Historical Society's assistant director, Sarah Piccini, describes the organization.
They were basically a vigilante group, for lack of a better term. They started out working primarily in the southern coal fields, working to kind of get better wages for coal miners. They were working kind of with the union, kind of not with the union. It's Workingmen's Benevolent Association. They were a group of miners who kind of took the law into their own hands. They weren't getting what they wanted, their wages weren't getting any better, their lives weren't getting any better. So they decided the easiest way to do it would be to kill the people who were causing them the problems. There were almost a dozen different mine officials and 8 coal agents who were killed and attributed to the Molly Maguires at the time in the 1870s.
The Molly Maguires are tied intimately to the region's working class and Irish heritage. Their memory recalls both the country's history of nativist sentiment and the strength of the immigrant spirit.
You know, they are always tied to the Irish. The name Molly Maguires itself comes from Molly Maguire, who was kind of a fictional figurehead who represented Ireland. It became part of an attack of nativism against them. Franklin Gowan, who was the president of the Reading Railroad at the time, was one responsible for kind of tidying up the Molly Maguires and getting rid of them. He tied them strongly to the Irish, but basically by making a case that the Irish are violent and savage because they did these things, and because they did these things, they are violent and savage. The Irish at the time, in the 1870s, were the low men on the totem pole. They were the ones who worked the hardest for the longest hours and the least amount of pay. So naturally, when people were taking care of those problems, it was the Irish who were, kind of standing up for themselves.
In Scranton, many mine owners and operators lived in grand and still standing mansions. Meanwhile, the miners paid to live in company housing.
No matter where you were, if you owned a mine and had hundreds of people working for you in poor conditions, nobody liked you. I think that kind of echoed around here.
Despite not being a Scranton-based organization, their reach extended into the city and almost impacted the city's history in a major way.
There is actually in our archives one of the letters from the Pinkertons. There was a Molly Maguire meeting in Carbondale. They tried to put out a hit on W.W. Scranton, but apparently it wasn't proposed properly. They didn't follow parliamentary procedure, so nothing actually came of it.
Eventually, the miners' insolence could be tolerated no longer. An investigation by the nationally significant Pinkerton Detective Organization resulted in the trial and hanging of 10 Mollys for involvement in the murder of mine bosses. The organization soon collapsed. Whatever change that would come would have to come through other means.
The end of the Union and the rise of the Mollys were kind of tied together, primarily because of Franklin Gowan, who had it in for everybody. But he kind of tied them together, so it was easier for him to both destroy the Mollys and take down the Union. Basically, the next union to fill in was Knights of Labor, with Terence Powderly. He was the mayor of Scranton later. But Powderly's Knights of Labor was kind of the next union to kind of fill in the void before the United Mine Workers really got started and got their foundations. So somebody else had to step in. Conditions weren't improving. Somebody had to try and work with the coal companies and try and make something good happen. And it seemed that negotiation was better than outright murder.
Today, the Lackawanna Historical Society bears reminders of the era that brought about the Mollies, an era in which the plight of the most vulnerable workers was largely disregarded. Over the years, the Molly Maguires have become perceived as a more empathetic and heroic group. Reminders of them have popped up in film and become part of our national story.
I don't think the Molly Maguires really got farther than the Pennsylvania coalfields. So at the time, I think if you had mentioned to a miner in Colorado about the Molly Maguires, they would have said who. So it was a local thing at the time, but I think now it's more of a popular culture that's kind of tied into it. There's a lot of bars named after the Molly Maguires now, so there's kind of still an echo of them in the area. They don't really talk about them as this savage, bloodthirsty band anymore. It's sort of a romantic notion of, helping the poor and helping the oppressed, but nothing else seemed to be getting the job done.
It's important to note that even in the 1800s, some mourned the hanging of Molly Maguire members, or at least lamented their circumstance. A Carbon County judge described the trials that led to the hangings as a surrender of state sovereignty, noting that they were investigated by a private corporation and arrested by a private police force. He said, "The state provided only the courtroom and the gallows." This is Peter Shaver.